Imagine you're about to give birth, but there's no hospital, no doctor, no nurse, no ultrasound, no painkillers, no antibiotics, no emergency surgery, no ambulance to call if something goes wrong. Now imagine this wasn't 500 years ago, or even 5,000 years ago. Imagine it was 100,000 years ago. You're surrounded by forests, wild animals, harsh weather, and a small group of people struggling just to survive another day. Yet somehow, humanity survived. Every person alive today exists because millions of mothers before us successfully gave birth under conditions we would consider unimaginable. But how? How did ancient humans survive childbirth without modern medicine? And perhaps an even bigger question, why is human childbirth so dangerous in the first place? Because compared to almost every other mammal on Earth, humans are surprisingly bad at giving birth, and the answer begins millions of years before the first human was ever born. To understand how ancient humans gave birth, we first need to answer a different question. Why is human childbirth so much harder than it is for most other animals? After all, if you've ever watched a deer, a horse, or even a chimpanzee give birth, one thing becomes obvious. Many animals can stand up and walk within minutes or hours after giving birth. Some newborns can even run on the same day they're born. Human babies can't. They're completely helpless. They can't walk. They can't feed themselves. They can't even hold up their own heads. So what makes humans so different? The answer lies in one of the biggest turning points in our evolutionary history. Millions of years ago, our ancestors began walking on two legs. This adaptation, known as bipedalism, was revolutionary. Walking upright freed our hands to carry food, make tools, and eventually build civilizations. It was one of the greatest advantages our ancestors ever gained, but evolution is full of trade-offs. As our bodies adapted to walking efficiently, our pelvis changed shape. A narrower pelvis made upright walking more stable and energy efficient, but it also created a serious problem. The birth canal became more restricted. Then evolution introduced another challenge. Our brains kept getting bigger. Over millions of years, the brains of early humans expanded dramatically. Larger brains meant greater intelligence, better problem solving, and a huge survival advantage. But larger brains also meant larger heads. And suddenly, evolution faced a dilemma. A baby with a larger head had to pass through a relatively narrow birth canal. Anthropologists sometimes call this the obstetric dilemma. While modern research suggests the story is more complex than this idea alone, the basic evolutionary trade-off remains important. Humans evolved for both efficient walking and increasingly large brains, and those pressures helped make childbirth unusually difficult compared with many other mammals. In fact, human babies don't simply slide out. During birth, they usually have to rotate several times as they move through the birth canal. This complex sequence of movements is far more intricate than in most other primates. Even a small problem with this rotation can make labor much more dangerous. That's one reason why childbirth has historically carried significant risks for both mother and baby. But evolution found an imperfect solution. Instead of waiting until the brain was fully developed, human babies began being born earlier. Compared to other primates, human newborns are remarkably immature. Scientists sometimes describe this as humans being born neurologically underdeveloped relative to how much brain growth still lies ahead. Around 3/4 of our brain growth happens after birth. That's why human babies require years of constant care. It's also why childhood lasts much longer in humans than in almost any other animal. This dependence became one of our greatest strengths, because raising a human child wasn't a job for one mother alone. It often required fathers, grandparents, siblings, and other members of the group. Anthropologists believe this cooperative care played an important role in human survival. In other words, our greatest weakness may have helped create one of our greatest evolutionary advantages: cooperation. But even with help, childbirth remained incredibly dangerous. Without modern medicine, a baby in the wrong position, excessive bleeding, or an infection could quickly become life-threatening. So this raises another fascinating question. If childbirth was so risky, how did ancient humans manage to survive generation after generation? The answer wasn't strength, it wasn't luck. It was something that may have changed the course of human history forever. They didn't face childbirth alone. If you imagine an ancient woman giving birth completely alone in the middle of the wilderness, you're probably imagining the wrong picture. Movies often portray prehistoric humans as isolated individuals constantly fighting for survival. But archaeological evidence and studies of traditional hunter-gatherer societies suggest something very different. Humans survived because they cooperated, and childbirth was no exception. Anthropologists believe that in most cases, women likely gave birth with the help of other women in their group, experienced mothers, grandmothers, female relatives, or women who had assisted in previous births. In other words, before there were doctors or hospitals, there were caregivers. These women didn't have medical degrees, but they had something just as valuable for their time: experience. They knew how labor usually progressed. They recognized when a mother was struggling. They could offer physical support, reassurance, and practical knowledge passed down through generations. This tradition of experienced women assisting childbirth is so widespread across cultures that many researchers believe it has deep roots in human history. In fact, humans are unusual among primates. Many primates are capable of giving birth on their own. Human mothers, however, often benefit from assistance because of the complex way babies rotate during birth. A helper could support the mother, encourage effective pushing, comfort her during labor, and care for the newborn immediately after birth. These seemingly simple acts may have dramatically improved survival. But childbirth wasn't only a physical challenge, it was also an emotional one. Pain, fear, exhaustion, uncertainty. Those emotions are universal, whether someone gave birth 100,000 years ago or today. Even without modern science, ancient people likely understood that a calm, supportive environment mattered. Many traditional societies developed rituals surrounding childbirth. Some used songs, others used rhythmic breathing, some preferred quiet, private spaces, others believed certain family members should remain nearby. The details differed from culture to culture, but the underlying idea was remarkably similar. A woman giving birth should not be abandoned. That may seem obvious today, but from an evolutionary perspective, it reveals something profound. Humans didn't become the planet's dominant species because we were the strongest. We became successful because we learned to help one another. Childbirth may be one of the oldest examples of that cooperation. Of course, not every birth ended happily, without antibiotics, without blood transfusions, without emergency surgery. Even relatively small complications could become fatal. A baby positioned sideways, a prolonged labor, heavy bleeding after birth, an infection from a small wound, any of these could claim the life of a mother, her baby, or both. Researchers estimate that maternal and infant mortality in prehistoric and ancient societies was far higher than it is today, although exact rates are impossible to know because written records do not exist for prehistoric populations. Every successful birth carried enormous risk, which makes a remarkable fact easy to overlook. Every one of your ancestors survived, not because childbirth was easy, but because generation after generation, enough mothers, babies, and communities endured extraordinary challenges. The odds were never perfect, yet humanity kept growing. And perhaps that's one of the greatest achievements in our history. But there's another mystery. If childbirth was so dangerous, why didn't evolution simply make it easier? Why are human babies still born through one of the most difficult birth processes in the animal kingdom? The answer reveals something surprising about evolution itself. It doesn't create perfection, it creates solutions that are good enough to survive. It's easy to assume that evolution always creates the perfect solution, but that's not how evolution works. Evolution doesn't plan ahead, it doesn't design the ideal body. So why didn't evolution fix this? Because evolution was balancing two competing demands. On one side was intelligence. Larger brains allowed our ancestors to make better tools, hunt more effectively, communicate through increasingly complex language, and adapt to changing environments. On the other side was efficient walking. Walking upright allowed humans to travel long distances while using less energy than many other forms of movement. Both traits were enormous advantages, but together they created a biological compromise. A pelvis wide enough to make childbirth easier could reduce the efficiency of upright walking. A pelvis optimized for walking leaves less room for childbirth. Rather than eliminating the problem, evolution settled on a balance. Not perfect, just good enough. This is why biologists often describe evolution as a process of trade-offs, not perfect engineering, and humans aren't the only species with compromises. A giraffe's long neck helps it reach food high in trees, but it also creates challenges for pumping blood to the brain. A peacock's magnificent tail attracts mates, but it also makes escaping predators more difficult. Every adaptation comes with costs. Human intelligence came with one of the greatest costs of all, one of the most difficult births in the animal kingdom. Ironically, the same large brain that made childbirth dangerous also gave humans the ability to solve that danger. We learned from experience, we shared knowledge, we developed traditions. Eventually, we invented medicine. Thousands of years later came trained midwives, then antiseptics, then anesthesia, then blood transfusions, then cesarean sections that could save lives when natural birth became impossible. Today, many complications that once almost certainly meant death can be treated. That doesn't mean childbirth is easy. Even with modern medicine, pregnancy and childbirth still carry real risks. But compared to the lives of our ancient ancestors, the difference is extraordinary. For most of human history, giving birth was one of the greatest dangers a woman would ever face. Today, millions of mothers and babies survive because of generations of scientific discovery and medical progress. It's one of humanity's greatest achievements, and yet, despite all our technology, one thing has never changed. Every single person alive today entered the world the same way, through the courage of someone willing to endure childbirth. When we study ancient humans, it's easy to focus on hunting, on tools, on fire, on cave paintings, but perhaps we overlook the most important story of all. None of those achievements would have mattered if mothers hadn't survived long enough to raise the next generation. Civilizations weren't built only by hunters, or kings, or inventors. They were built by countless women whose names history never recorded. Women who endured pain, faced uncertainty, and gave humanity its future. So the next time you think about ancient humans, don't just imagine warriors, or mammoths, or stone tools. Imagine a mother holding her newborn child thousands of years ago. And generation after generation, they gave us the gift of being here today.